All right. That is pretty good. So that was Source Code by Mega Drive from his 19 or she, I have no idea, 1990X AD album. Figured it was suitably gritty and crunchy while also having an appropriate name. There were a couple other tracks I wanted to do in as another possibility, but that one struck me as appropriate. And it's relatively laid back compared to some of his stuff, which is can be a bit frenetic, excessively eccentric, maybe. All right. Helps if I turn that off so you can see the title of the book. So, welcome back, as ever, to Storytime Saturdays. I am your intrepid, plucky, and hopefully adequate for your purposes uh, narrator, Fragath. And today is the final installment of Neal Stephenson's Snow Crash, which is great. So, what did we do last time? Last time, last time, Hero has been steadily fighting his way onto the raft, onto the Enterprise, the core boat of the raft, which is a converted aircraft carrier that L. Bob Reif, the antagonist, lead antagonist, the big bad, if you will, of this series, of this book, has been used as his headquarters. And YT wound up getting captured by said L. Bob Reif, um, who incidentally also had the clay tablet with some of our good friend Enki, Enki's Nam Shubs on it. Presumably the ones that'll keep these memetic viruses and DNA viruses from being quite so effective on the human populace. And there goes my phone. Give me 30 seconds. All right, sorry about that, folks. Oh, nope, nope. One sec. Getting called again. All right, that call was bogus. No big deal. It's funny because I had to do this early. Any long-term viewers know that I'm doing this like an hour earlier than I normally do, and that's due to scheduling conflicts. And that's largely what those phone calls are about. Because I was like, okay, I'll be there for the meeting. But no, no. No, it'd be too easy. Too easy. Let me just double check and make sure I've got all my water and stuff. Yes, 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 and yes. I got my tea. I got my water. Mm. I got my book. We are ready. We are ready. Oh, shoot. There's one thing we're not ready for. It's not going to work, is it? Probably not. Why do you ask? Uh, well, let's see what happens then. Ah, rassum frassum. All right. Well, that's really annoying. Whatever, it'll be recorded anyway. Just not the way I'd like it to be recorded. Alrighty, this is going to be a bit fast and loose, but yeah, so prepare yourselves for the final installment of Neal Stephenson's Snow Crash. Chapter 61. For a minute or so, the chopper hovers 20 feet overhead. All the people inside are staring down at the tablet, which has burst out of its wrappings in the middle of the bullseye. The plastic is torn apart around the corners, and fragments, large fragments, of the tablet have sprayed out for a few feet in either direction. Hero stares at it too, still safe behind the cover of a parked chopper. He stares at it so hard that he forgets to stare at anything else. Then a couple of wireheads land on his back, smashing his face into the flank of the chopper. He slides down and lands on his belly. His gun arm is still free, but a couple more wireheads sit on that. A couple of on his legs, too. He can't move at all. He can't see anything but the broken tablet 20 feet away on the flight deck. The sound and wind of Rife's chopper diminish into a distant puttering noise that takes a long time to go away completely. He feels a tingling behind his ear, anticipating the scalpel and the drill. These wireheads are operating under remote control from somewhere else. Ing seemed to think they had an organized raft defense system. Maybe there's a hacker in charge. An N sitting in Enterprise's control tower, moving these guys around like an air traffic controller. In any case, they are not very big on spontaneity. They sit on him for a few minutes before they decide what to do next. Then, many hands reach down and clasp him around the wrists and ankles, elbows and knees. They haul him across the flight deck like pallbearers, face up. Hero looks up into the control tower and sees a couple of faces looking down at him. One of them, the N, is talking into a microphone. Eventually, they come to a big flat elevator that sinks down into the guts of the ship, out of view of the control tower. It comes to rest on one of the lower decks, apparently a hangar deck where they used to maintain airplanes. Hero hears a woman's voice, speaking words gently but clearly. Me lulu mu al nu me en ki me en me lulu mu e me al nu me al nu me mu lu e al nu me dug ga mu lu e al nu me. It's 3 feet straight down to the deck, and he covers the distance in free fall, slamming down on his back, bumping his head. All his limbs bounce loosely on the metal. Around him he sees and hears the wireheads collapsing like wet towels falling off a rack. He cannot move any part of his body. He has a little control over his eyes. A face comes into view, and he has trouble resolving it, can't quite focus. But he recognizes something in her posture, the way she tosses her hair back over her shoulder when it falls down. It's Juanita. Juanita with an antenna rising out of the base of her skull. She kneels down beside him, bends down, cups one hand around his ear, and whispers. The hot air tickles his ear. He tries to move away from it, but can't. She's whispering another long string of syllables. Then she straightens up and gooses him in the side. He jerks away from her. "Get up, lazy bones," she says. He gets up. He's fine now. But all the wireheads lay around him, perfectly motionless. "Just a little nam shub I whipped up," she says. "They'll be fine." "Hi," he says. "Hi. It's good to see you, hero. I'm going to give you a hug now. Watch out for the antenna." She does. He hugs her back. The antenna is upside his nose, but that's okay. "Once we get this thing taken off, all the hair and stuff should grow back," she whispers. Finally, she lets him go. "That hug was really more for me than for you. It's been a lonely time here, lonely and scary." This is typically paradoxical behavior for Juanita, getting touchy-feely at a time like this. "Don't get me wrong," Hero says, "but aren't you one of the bad guys now?" "Oh, you mean this?" "Yeah. Don't you work for them?" "If so, I'm not doing a very good job." She laughs, gesturing at the ring of motionless wireheads. "No, this doesn't work on me. It sort of did for a while, but there are ways to fight it." "Why? Why doesn't it work on you?" "I've spent the last several years hanging around with Jesuits," she says. "Look, your brain has an immune system just like your body. The more you use it, the more viruses you get exposed to, the better your immune system becomes. And I've got a hell of an immune system. Remember, I was an atheist for a while, and then I came back to religion the hard way." "Why didn't they screw you up the way they did to Fivid?" "I came here voluntarily." "Like Inanna?" "Yes." "Why would anyone come here voluntarily?" "Hero, don't you realize? This is it. This is the nerve center of a religion that is at once brand new and very ancient. Being here is like following Jesus or Mohammed around, getting to observe the birth of a new faith." "But it's terrible. Rife is the Antichrist." "Of course he is. But it's still interesting. And Rife has got something else going for him. Eridu." "The city of Enki." "Exactly. He's got every tablet Enki ever wrote. For a person who's interested in religion and hacking, this is the only place in the world to be. If those tablets were in Arabia, I'd put on a chador and burn my driver's license and go there. But the tablets are here, and so I let them wire me up instead."
So all this time your goal was to study Enki's tablets.
"To get them May, just like Inanna. What else?"
And have you been studying them?
"Oh, yes."
And?
She points to the fallen wireheads. "And I can do it now. I'm a Baal Shem. I can hack the brainstem."
Okay, look. I'm happy for you, Juanita, but at the time being, we have a little problem.
"We're surrounded by 1 million people who want to kill us. Can you paralyze all of them?" "Yes," she says. "But then they'd die."
You know what we have to do, don't you, Juanita?
"Release the Nam Shub of Enki," she says. "Do the Babel thing."
Let's get it. Let's go get it, Hero says.
"First things first," Juanita says. "The control tower."
Okay, you get ready to grab the tablet, and I'll take out the control tower.
"How are you going to do that? By cutting people up with swords?"
Yeah, that's the only thing they're good for.
"Let's do it the other way around," Juanita says. She gets up and walks off across the hangar deck. The Nam Shub of Enki is a tablet wrapped up in a clay envelope covered with the cuneiform equivalent of a warning sticker. The entire assembly has shattered into dozens of pieces. Most of them have stayed wrapped up inside the plastic, but some have gone spinning across the flight deck. Hero gathers them up from the helipad and returns them to the center. By the time he's got the plastic wrapper cut away, Juanita is waving to him from the windows on top of the control tower. He takes all the pieces that look to be part of the envelope and puts them into a separate pile. Then he assembles the remains of the tablet itself into a coherent group.
It's not obvious, yet, how to piece them together, and he doesn't have time for jigsaw puzzles. So he goggles into his office, uses the computer to take an electronic snapshot of the fragments, and calls the librarian. Yes, sir. This hypercard contains a picture of a shattered clay tablet. Do you know of some software that would be any good at piecing it back together? One moment, sir, the librarian says. Then a hypercard appears in his hand. He gives it to Hero. It contains a picture of an assembled tablet. That's how it looks, sir. Can you read Sumerian? Yes, sir. Can you read this tablet out loud? Yes, sir. Get ready to do it. And hold on a second. Hero walks over to the base of the control tower. There's a door there that gives him access to a stairwell. He climbs up to the control room, a strange mixture of Iron Age and high tech. Juanita's waiting there, surrounded by peacefully slumbering wireheads. She taps a microphone that is projecting from a communications panel at the end of a flexible gooseneck, the same mic that the N was speaking into. Live to the raft, she says. Go for it. Hero puts his computer into speakerphone mode and stands up next to the microphone. Librarian, read it back, he says, and a string of syllables pours out of the speaker. In the middle of it, Hero glances up at Juanita. She's standing in the far corner of the room with her fingers stuck in her ears. Down at the base of the stairs, a wirehead begins to talk. Deep down inside the Enterprise, there's more talking going on, and none of it makes any sense. It's just a lot of babbling. There's an external catwalk on the control tower. Hero goes out there and listens to the raft. From all around them comes a dim roar, not waves of or wind, but of a million unchained human voices speaking in a confusion of tongues. Juanita comes out to listen too. Hero sees a trickle of red under her ear. You're bleeding, he says. I know, a little bit of primitive surgery, she says. Her voice is strained and uncomfortable. I've been carrying around a scalpel blade for cases like this. What did you do? Slid it up under the base of the antenna and cut the wire that goes into my skull, she says. When did you do that? While you were down on the flight deck. Why? Why do you think? She says. So I wouldn't be exposed to the Nam Shub of Enki. I'm a neurolinguistic hacker now, Hero. I went through hell to obtain this knowledge. It's a part of me. Don't expect me to submit to a lobotomy. If we get out of this, will you be my girl? Naturally, she says. Now let's get out of it. Chapter 62. I was just doing my job, man, she says. This Enki dude wanted to get the message to Hero, and I delivered it. Shut up, Rife says. He doesn't say it like he's pissed. He just wants her to be quiet. Because what she did doesn't make any difference now that all those wireheads have piled on top of Hero. YT looks out of the window. They are buzzing across the Pacific, keeping pretty low down so that the water skims quickly beneath them. She doesn't know how fast they're going, but it looks to be pretty damn fast. She always thought the ocean was supposed to be blue, but in fact it's the most boring gray color she's ever seen, and there's miles and miles of it. After a few minutes, another chopper catches up with them and begins flying alongside, pretty close, in formation. It's the rare chopper, the one full of medics. Through its cabin window, she can see Raven sitting in one of the seats. At first, she thinks he's still unconscious because he's kind of hunched over, not moving. Then he lifts his head, and she sees that he's goggled into the metaverse. He reaches up with one hand and pulls the goggles up onto his forehead for a moment, squints out the window, and sees her watching him. Their eyes meet, and her heart starts flopping around weakly, like a bunny in a Ziploc bag. He grins and waves. YT sits back in her seat and pulls the shade down over the window. Chapter 63. From Hero's front yard to L. Bob Rife's black cube at port 127 is halfway around the metaverse, a distance of 32,768. Sorry. Let's try that again. Chapter 63. From Hero's front yard to L. Bob Rife's black cube at port 127 is halfway around the metaverse, a distance of 32,768 kilometers. The only hard part, really, is getting out of the downtown. He can ride his bike straight through the avatars as usual, but the street is also cluttered with vehicles, animations, commercial displays, public plazas, and other bits of solid-looking software that get in his way. Not to mention a few distractions. Off to his right, about a kilometer away from the Black Sun, is a deep hole in the Hyper Manhattan skyline. It is an open plaza about a mile wide. A park of sorts where avatars can gather for concerts and conventions and festivals. Most of it is occupied by a deep dish amphitheater that is capable of seating close to 1 million avatars at once. Down at the bottom is a huge circular stage. Normally, the stage is occupied by major rock groups. Tonight, it is occupied by the grandest and most brilliant computer hallucinations the human mind can invent. The three-dimensional marquee hangs above it, announcing tonight's event. A benefit graphics concert staged on behalf of David Meyer, who is still hospitalized with an inexplicable disease. The amphitheater is half filled with hackers. Once he gets out of downtown, Hero twists the throttle up to the max and covers the remaining 32,000 and some kilometers in the space of about 10 minutes. Over his head, the express trains are whooshing down the track at a metaphorical speed of 10,000 miles per hour. He passes them like they're standing still. This only works because he's riding in an absolutely straight line. He's got a routine coded into his motorcycle software that makes it follow the monorail track automatically, so he doesn't have to even worry about steering it. Meanwhile, Juanita's standing next to him in reality. She's got another pair of goggles. She can see all the same things that Hero sees. Rife's got a mobile uplink on his corporate chopper, just like the one on commercial airliners, so he can patch into the metaverse when he's in the air. As long as he's airborne, that's his only link to the metaverse. We may be able to hack our way into that one link and block it or something. That low-level communications stuff is too full of medicine for us to mess with it in this decade, Hero says, braking his motorcycle to a stop. Holy shit, it's just like YT described it. He's in front of port 127. Rife's black cube is there, just as YT described it. There's no door. Hero starts walking away from the street toward the cube. It reflects no light at all, so he can't tell whether it's 10 feet away or 10 miles away from him until the security daemons begin to materialize. There are half a dozen of them, all big, sturdy avatars in blue coveralls, sort of quasi-military looking, but without rank. They don't need rank because they're all running the same program. They materialize around him in a neat semicircle with a radius of about 10 feet, blocking Hero's way to the cube. Hero mumbles a word under his breath and vanishes. He slips into his invisible avatar. It would be very interesting to hang around and see how these security daemons deal with it, but right now he has to get moving before they get a chance to adjust. They don't, at least not very well. Hero runs between two of the security daemons and heads for the wall of the cube. He finally gets there, slamming into it, coming to a dead stop. The security daemons have all turned around and are chasing him. They can figure out where he is, the computer tells them that much, but they can't do much to him. Like the bouncer daemons in the Black Sun, which Hero helped write, they shove people around by applying basic rules of avatar physics. When Hero is invisible, there is very little for them to shove. But if they are well written, they may have more subtle ways of messing him up, so he's not wasting any time. He pokes his katana through the side of the cube and follows it through the wall and out the other side. This is a hack. It is really based on a very old hack, a loophole that he found years ago when he was trying to graft the sword fighting rules onto the existing metaverse software.
His blade doesn't have the power to cut a hole in the wall. This would mean permanently changing the shape of someone else's building. But it does have the power to penetrate things. Avatars do not have that power. That is the whole purpose of a wall in the metaverse. It is a structure that does not allow avatars to penetrate it. But, like anything else in the metaverse, this rule is nothing but a protocol, a convention that different computers agree to follow. In theory, it cannot be ignored. But in practice, it depends upon the ability of different computers to swap information very precisely, at high speed, and at just the right times. And when you are connected to the system over a satellite uplink, as Hero is, out here on the raft, there is a delay as the signals bounce up to the satellite and back down. That delay can be taken advantage of if you move quickly and don't look back. Hero passes right through the wall on the tail end of his all-penetrating katana. Rifeland is a vast, brilliantly lit space occupied by elementary shapes done up in primary colors. It is like being inside an educational toy designed to teach solid geometry to 3-year-olds. Cubes, spheres, tetrahedrons, polyhedrons, connected with a web of cylinders and lines and helices. But in this case, it has gone way, way out of control, as if every Tinker Toy set and Lego block ever made has been slapped together according to some long forgotten scheme. Hero's been around the metaverse long enough to know that despite the bright, cheery appearance of this thing, it is, in fact, as simple and utilitarian as an army camp. This is a model of a system. A big, complicated system. The shapes probably represent computers, or central nodes in Rife's worldwide network, or Pearly Gates franchises, or any other kind of local and regional offices that Rife has going around the world. By clambering over this structure and going into those bright shapes, Hero could probably uncover some of the code that makes Rife's network operate. He could, perhaps, try to hack it up, as Juanita suggested. But there is no point messing with something he doesn't understand. He might waste hours fooling around with some piece of code only to find out that it was the software to control the automatic toilet flushers at Rife Bible College. So, Hero keeps moving, keeps looking up at the tangle of shapes, trying to find a pattern. He knows now that he has found his way into the boiler room of the entire metaverse, but he has no idea what he's looking for. The system, he realizes, really consists of several separate networks all tangled together in the same space. There's an extremely complicated tangle of fine red lines, millions of them, running back and forth between thousands of small red balls. Just as a wild guess, Hero figures that this may represent Rife's fiber optics network, with its innumerable local offices and nodes spread all over the world. There are a number of less complicated networks in other colors, which might represent coaxial lines, such as they used to use for cable television, or even voice phone lines. And there is a crude, heavily built, blocky network all done up in blue. It consists of a small number, fewer than a dozen, of big blue cubes. They are connected to each other, but to nothing else. By massive blue tubes, the tubes are transparent, and inside of them, Hero can see bundles of smaller connections in various colors. It has taken Hero a while to see all of this, because the blue cubes are nearly obscured. They are all surrounded by little red balls and other small nodes, like trees being overwhelmed with kudzu. It appears to be an older, pre-existing network of some kind, with its own internal channels, mostly primitive ones like voice phone. Rife has patched into it, heavily, with his own higher tech systems. Hero maneuvers until he can get a closer look at one of the blue cubes, peering through the clutter of lines that has grown around it. The blue cube has a big white star on each of its 6 faces. "It's the government of the United States," Juanita says. "Where hackers go to die," Hero says. The largest, and yet the least efficient, producer of computer software in the world. Hero and YT have eaten a lot of junk food together in different joints all over LA.
Donuts, burritos, pizza, sushi, you name it. And all YT ever talks about is her mother and that terrible job that she has with the feds. The regimentation, the lie detector tests. The fact that for all the work she does, she really has no idea what it is that the government is really working on. It has always been a mystery to Hero, too, but then that's how the government is. It was invented to do stuff that private enterprise doesn't bother with, which means that there's probably no reason for it. You never know what they're doing or why. Hackers have traditionally looked upon the government's coding sweatshops with horror and just tried to forget that all of that shit ever existed. But they have thousands of programmers. The programmers work 12 hours a day out of some twisted sense of personal loyalty. Their software engineering techniques, while cruel and ugly, are very sophisticated. They must have been up to something. Juanita? Yeah? Don't ask me why I think this, but I think that the government has been undertaking a big software development project for L. Bob Reif. Makes sense, she says. He has such a love-hate relationship with his programmers. He needs them, but he won't trust them. The government's the only organization he would trust to write something important. I wonder what it is. Hold on, Hero says. Hold on. He is now a stone's throw away from a big blue cube sitting at ground level. All the other blue cubes sort of feed into it. There is a motorcycle parked next to the cube, rendered in color, but just one notch above black and white. Big, raggedy pixels and a limited color palette. It has a sidecar. Ravens standing next to it. He is carrying something in his arms. It is another simple geometric construction, a long, smooth blue ellipsoid a couple of feet in length. From the way he's moving, Hero thinks that Raven has just removed it from the blue cube. He carries it over to the motorcycle and nestles it into the sidecar. The big one, Hero says. It's exactly what we were afraid of, Juanita says. Rife's revenge. Headed for the amphitheater, where all the hackers are gathered in one place. Rife's going to infect all of them at once. He's going to burn their minds. Sorry about that. Just grabbing a drink of water. Chapter 64. Raven's already on the motorcycle. If Hero chases him on foot, he might catch him before he reaches the street. But he might not. In that case, Raven would be on his way to downtown at tens of thousands of miles per hour, while Hero was still trying to get back to his own motorcycle. At those speeds, once Hero has lost sight of Raven, he's lost him forever. Raven starts his bike, begins maneuvering carefully through the tangle, headed for the exit. Hero takes off as fast as his invisible legs can carry him, headed straight for the wall. He punches through a couple of seconds later, runs back to the street. His tiny little invisible avatar can't operate the motorcycle, so he returns to his normal look, hops on the bike, and gets it turned around. Looking back, he sees Raven riding out toward the street, the logic bomb glowing a soft blue, like heavy water in a reactor. He doesn't even see Hero yet. Now's his chance. He draws his katana, aims his bike at Raven, pumps it up to 60 or so miles an hour. No point in coming in too fast. The only way to kill Raven's avatar is to take its head off. Running it over with the motorcycle won't have any effect. A security daemon is running towards Raven, waving his arms. Raven looks up, sees Hero bearing down on him, and bursts forward. The sword cuts the air behind Raven's head. It's too late. Raven must be gone now. But turning himself around, Hero can see him in the middle of the street. He slammed into one of the stanchions that holds up the monorail track. a perennial irritation to high-speed motorcyclists. Shit, both of them say simultaneously. Raven gets turned toward downtown and twists his throttle just as Hero is pulling in behind him on the street, doing the same. Within a couple of seconds, they're both headed for downtown at something like 50,000 miles an hour. Hero's half a mile behind Raven, but can see him clearly. The streetlights have merged into a smooth twin streak of yellow, and Raven blazes in the middle, a storm of cheap color and big pixels. If I can take his head off, they're finished, Hero says. Gotcha, Juanita says, because if you kill Raven, he gets kicked out of the system, and he can't sign back on until the graveyard daemons dispose of his avatar. And I control the graveyard daemons, so all I have to do is kill the bastard once. Once they get their choppers back to land, they'll have better access to the net. They can have someone else go into the metaverse and take over for him, Juanita warns. Wrong, because Uncle Enzo and Mr. Lee are waiting for them on land. They have to do it during the next hour or never. Chapter 65. YT suddenly wakes up. She hadn't realized that she was asleep. Something about the thwop of the rotor blades must have lulled her. She must be tired as shit, is what it really is. What the fuck is going on with my comnet? L. Bob Rife is squalling. No one answers, the Russian pilot says. Not Reft, not LA, not Houston. Get me LAX on the phone then, Rife says. I want to take the jet to Houston. We'll get our butts over to the campus and find out what's going on. The pilot messes around on his control panel. Problem, he says. What? The pilot just shakes his head forlornly. Someone is messing with the Skyphone. We are being jammed. I might be able to get a line, the president says. Rife just gives him a look like, right, asshole. Anybody got a fucking quarter? Rife hollers. Frank and Tony are startled for a minute. We're gonna have to touch down at the first payphone we see and make a goddamn phone call. He laughs. Can you believe that? Me using a telephone? A second later, YT looks out the window and is blown away to see actual land down there and a two-lane highway winding its way down a warm, sandy coastline. It's California. The chopper slows, cuts in closer to land, begins following the highway. Most of it is free of plastic and neon lights, but before long they home in on a short bit of franchise ghetto, built on both sides of the road in a place where it has cut away from the beach some distance. The chopper sets down in the parking lot of a buy and fly. Fortunately, the lot's mostly empty. They don't cut any heads off. A couple of youths are playing video games inside, and they barely look up at the astonishing sight of the chopper. She's glad. YT is totally embarrassed to be seen with this dull assortment of old farts. The chopper just sits there, idling, while L. Bob Rife jumps out and runs over to the payphone bolted to the front wall. These guys were stupid enough to put her in the seat right next to the fire extinguisher. No reason not to take advantage of that fact. She jerks it out of its bracket, pulling out the safety pin in virtually the same motion, and squeezes the trigger, aiming it right into Tony's face. Nothing happens. Fuck! She shouts, and throws it at him, or rather pushes it towards him. He's just leaning forward, grabbing at her wrist, and the impact of the extinguisher hitting his face is enough to put a major dent in his tood. Gives her enough time to swing her legs out of the chopper. Everything's getting fucked up. One of her pockets is zipped open, and as she's half falling, half rolling out of the chopper, the fire extinguisher bracket catches in that pocket and holds her. By the time she's gotten free of that, Tony's back, now on his hands and knees, reaching out for her arm. That she manages to avoid. She's running out freely into the parking lot. At the back, she's hemmed in by the buy-in fly, along the sides of the tall border fence that separates this place from a neo-Aquarian temple on one side and a Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong franchise on the other. The only way to escape is out onto the road, on the other side of the chopper. But the pilot and Frank and Tony have already jumped out and are blocking her exit onto the road. Neo-Aquarian Temple isn't going to help her. If she begs and pleads, they might just include her in their mantras next week. But Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong is another story. She runs to the fence and starts trying to climb it. 8 feet of chain link with razor ribbon on top. But her clothing should stop the razor ribbon. Mostly. She gets about halfway up. Then, pudgy but strong arms are around her waist. She's out of luck. L. Bob Reif lifts her right off the fence, both arms and both legs kicking the air uselessly. He backs up a couple of steps and starts carrying her back toward the chopper. She looks back at the Hong Kong franchise. It was a close thing. Someone's in the parking lot. A courier, cruising in off the highway, just kind of chilling out and taking it real easy. "Hey!" she screams. She reaches up and punches the lapel switch on her coverall, turning it bright blue and orange. "Hey! I'm a courier. My name's YT. These maniac scum guys kidnapped me." "Wow," the courier says. "What a drag." Then he asks her something. But she can't hear it because the helicopter is whirling up its blades. "They're taking me to LAX!" she screams at the top of her lungs. Then Rife slams her into the chopper face first. The chopper lifts off, tracked precisely by an audience of antennas on the roof of Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong. In the parking lot, the courier watches the chopper taking off. It's really cool to watch, and it has a lot of bumping guns on it. But those dudes inside of the chopper were harshing that chick major. The courier pulls his personal phone out of its holster, jacks into the Radix Central Command, and punches a big red button. He calls a code. That's with a capital C. 2,500 couriers are massed on the reinforced concrete banks of the LA River. Down in the bottom trench of the river, Vitaly Chernobyl and the Meltdowns are just hitting the really good part of their next major hit single, Control Rod Jam. A number of the couriers are taking advantage of this soundtrack to style up and down the banks of the river. Only Vitaly, live, can get their adrenaline pumping hard enough to enable them to skate a sharp bank at 80 miles an hour plus without doing a Wilson into the Crete. And then the dark mass of the Meltdown fans turns into a gyrating orange-red galaxy as 2,500 new stars appear. It's a mind-blowing sight, and at first they think it's a new visual effect put together by Vitali and his imagiers. It is like a mass flicking of Bix, except brighter and more organized. Each courier looks down on his or her belt to see that a red light is flashing on their personal telephone. It looks like some poor skater called in a code. In a Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong franchise on the outskirts of Phoenix, rat thing number B782 comes awake. Fido is waking up because the dogs are barking tonight. There is always barking. Much of the barking is very far away. Fido knows that far away barks are not as important as close barks, and so he often sleeps through these. But sometimes a faraway bark will carry a special sound that makes Fido excited, and he can't help waking up. He is hearing one of those barks right now. It comes from far away, but it is urgent. Some nice doggy somewhere is very upset. He is so upset that his barking has spread to all the other doggies in the pack. Fido listens to the bark. He gets excited too. Some bad strangers have just been very close to a nice doggy's yard. They were in a flying thing. They had a lot of guns. Fido doesn't like guns very much. A stranger with a gun shot him once and made him hurt. Then the nice girl came and helped him. These are extremely bad strangers. Any nice doggy in his right mind would want to hurt them and make them go away. As Fido listens to the bark, he sees what they look like and hears the way they sound. If any of these very bad strangers ever come into his yard, he will be extremely upset. Then Fido notices that the bad strangers are chasing someone. He can tell they are hurting her by the way her voice sounds and the way she moves. The bad strangers are hurting the nice girl who loves him. Fido gets more angry than he has ever been, even more angry than when a bad man shot him long ago. His job is to keep bad strangers out of his yard. He does not do anything else. But it's even more important to protect the nice girl who loves him. That is more important than anything, and nothing can stop him, not even the fence. The fence is very tall, but he can remember a long time ago when he used to jump over things that were taller than his head. Fido comes out of his doggy house, curls his long legs beneath him, and jumps over the fence around his yard before he has remembered that he is not capable of jumping over it. This contradiction is lost on him, though. As a dog, introspection is not one of his strong points. The bark is spreading to another place far away. All the nice doggies who live in this faraway place are being warned to look out for very bad strangers and the girl who loves Fido, because they are going to that place. Fido sees the place in his mind. It is big and wide and flat and open, like a nice field for chasing frisbees. It has lots of big flying things. Around the edges are a couple of yards where nice doggies live. Fido can hear those nice doggies barking in reply. He knows where they are. Far away. But you can get there by streets. Fido knows a whole lot of different streets. He just runs down streets, and he knows where he is and where he's going. At first, the only trace that B782 leaves of his passage is a dancing trail of sparks down the center of the franchise ghetto. But once he makes his way out onto a long, straight piece of highway, he begins to leave further evidence. A spume of shattered blue safety glass spraying outward in parallel veins from all four lanes of traffic as the windows and the windshields of the cars blow out of their frames, spraying into the air like rooster tails behind a speedboat. As part of Mr. Lee's good neighbor policy, all rat things are programmed never to break the sound barrier in a populated area. But Fido's in too much of a hurry to worry about the good neighbor policy. Jack the sound barrier. Bring the noise. In a word, aww, so sweet. Chapter 66. Raven, Hero says, let me tell you a story before I kill you. I'll listen, Raven says. It's a long ride. All vehicles in the metaverse have voice phones on them. Hero simply called home to the librarian and had him look up Raven's number. They are riding in lockstep across the black surface of the imaginary planet now, although Hero is gaining on Raven, meter by meter. My dad was in the army in World War II. Lied about his age to get in. They put him in the Pacific doing scut work. Anyway, he got captured by the Nipponese. So? So they took him back to Nippon, put him in a prison camp. There were a lot of Americans there, plus some Brits and some Chinese, and a couple of guys that they couldn't place. They looked like Indians, spoke a little English, but they spoke Russian even better. They were Aleuts, Raven says, American citizens, but no one had ever heard of them.
Most people don't know that the Japanese conquered American territory during the war. Several islands at the end of the Aleutian chain, inhabited by my people. They took the two most important Aleuts and put them in prison camps in Japan. One of them was the mayor of Attu, the most important civil authority. The other was even more important to us. He was the chief harpooner of the Aleut nation.
Hero says, the mayor got sick and died. He didn't have any immunities. But the harpooner was one tough son of a bitch. He got sick a few times, but he survived. Went out to work in the fields along with the rest of the prisoners, growing food for the war effort. Worked in the kitchen, preparing slop for the prisoners and the guards. He kept to himself a lot. Everyone avoided him because he smelled terrible. His bed stank up the barracks.
He was cooking up aconite whale poison from mushrooms and other substances that he found in the fields and secreted in his clothing, Raven says.
Besides, Hero continues, they were pissed at him because he broke out a window pane in the barracks once, and it let cold air in for the rest of the winter. Anyway, one day, after lunch, all of the guards became terribly sick.
Whale poison in the fish stew, Raven says.
The prisoners were already out working in the fields, and when the guards began to get sick, they began to march them all back in toward the barracks, because they couldn't keep watch over them when they were doubled over with stomach cramps. And this late in the war, it wasn't easy to bring in reinforcements. My father was last in the line of prisoners, and this Aleut guy was right in front of him.
Raven says, as the prisoners were crossing an irrigation ditch, the Aleut dove into the water and disappeared.
My father didn't know what to do, Hero says, until he heard a grunt from the guard who was bringing up the rear. He turned around and saw that this guard had a bamboo spear stuck all the way through his body. Just came out of nowhere, and he still couldn't see the Aleut. Then another guard went down with his throat slit, and there was the Aleut winding up and throwing another spear that brought down yet another guard.
He had been making harpoons and hiding them under the water in the irrigation ditches, Raven says.
Then my father realized, Hero continues, that he was doomed, because no matter what he said to the guards, they would consider him to have been a part of an escape attempt, and they would bring a sword and lop his head off. So, figuring he might as well bring down a few of the enemy before they got to him, he took the gun from the first guard who had been hit, jumped down into the cover of the irrigation ditch, and shot another couple of guards who were coming over to investigate.
Raven says, the Aleut ran for the border fence, which was a flimsy bamboo thing. There was supposedly a minefield there, but he ran straight across it with no trouble. Either he was lucky, or else the mines, if there were any, were few and far between.
They didn't bother to have strict perimeter security, Hero says, because Japan is an island, so even if someone escaped, where could they run to?
An Aleut could do it, though, Raven says. He could go to the nearest coastline and build himself a kayak. He could take to the open water and make his way up the coastline of Japan, then surf from one island to the next, all the way back to the Aleutians.
Right, Hero says, which is the only part of the story that I never understood, until I saw you on that open water, outrunning a speedboat in your kayak. Then I put it all together. Your father wasn't crazy. He had a perfectly good plan.
Yes, but your father didn't understand it.
My father ran in your father's footsteps across the minefield. They were free, in Nippon. Your father started heading downhill, toward the ocean. My father wanted to head uphill, into the mountains, figuring that they could maybe live in an isolated place until the war was over.
It was a stupid idea, Raven says. Japan is heavily populated. There is no place where they could have gone unnoticed.
My father didn't even know what a kayak was.
Ignorance is no excuse, Raven says.
Their arguing, the same argument we're having now, was their downfall. The Nipponese caught up with them on a road just outside of Nagasaki. They didn't even have handcuffs, so they tied their hands behind their backs with bootlaces and made them kneel on the road, facing each other. Then the lieutenant took out his sword from its sheath. It was an ancient sword. The lieutenant was from a proud family of samurai, and the only reason he was on this home front detail was that he had nearly had one leg blown off earlier in the war. He raised the sword up above my father's head. It made a high ringing sound in the air, Raven says, that hurt my father's ears. But it never came down. My father saw your father's skeleton kneeling in front of him. That was the last thing he ever saw. My father was facing away from Nagasaki, Hiro says. He was temporarily blinded by the light. He fell forward and pressed his face into the ground to get the terrible light out of his eyes. Then everything was back to normal again. Except my father was blind, Raven says. He could only listen to your father, fighting the lieutenant. It was a half-blind, one-legged samurai with a katana versus a big, strong, healthy man with his arms tied behind his back, Hiro says. A pretty interesting fight. A pretty fair one. My father won. And that was the end of the war. The occupation troops got there a couple of weeks later. My father went home and kicked around for a while and finally had a kid during the 70s. So did yours. Raven says, Amchitka, 1972. My father got nuked twice by you bastards. I understand the depth of your feelings, Hiro says. But don't you think you've had enough revenge? There is no such thing as enough, Raven says. Hiro guns his motorcycle forward and closes on Raven, swinging his katana. But Raven reaches back, watching him in the rearview mirror, and blocks the blow. He's carrying a big long knife in one hand. Then Raven cuts his speed down to almost nothing and dives in between a couple of the stanchions. Hiro overshoots him, slows down too much, and gets a glimpse of Raven screaming past him on the other side of the monorail. By the time he's accelerated and cut through another gap, Raven has already slalomed over to the other side. And so it goes. They run down the length of the street in an interlacing zigzag pattern, cutting back and forth under the monorail. The game is a simple one. All Raven has to do is make Hiro run into a stanchion. Hiro will come to a stop for a moment. By that time, Raven will be gone, out of visual range, and Hiro will have no way to track him. It's an easier game for Raven than for Hiro. But Hiro's better at this kind of thing than Raven is. That makes it a pretty even match. They slalom down the monorail track at speeds from 60 to 60,000 miles per hour. All around them, low-slung commercial developments and high-tech labs and amusement parks sprawl off into the darkness. Downtown is before them, as high and bright as the aurora borealis from the black water of the Bering Sea. Chapter 67. The first poon smacks into the belly of the chopper as they are coming in low over the valley. YT feels it rather than hears it. She knows that sweet impact so well that she can sense it like one of those super sensitive seismo thingies that detects earthquakes on the other side of the planet. Then half a dozen other poons strike in quick succession, and she has to force herself not to lean over and look out the window. Of course. The chopper's belly is a solid wall of Soviet steel. It'll hold poons like glue. If they just keep flying low enough to poon, which they have to keep the chopper under the Mafia's radar. She can hear the radio crackling up front. Take it up, Sasha. You're picking up some parasites. She looks out the window. The other chopper, the little aluminum corporate number, is flying alongside them, a little bit higher in the air, and all the people inside of it are peering out the windows, watching the pavement underneath them. Except for Raven. Raven is still goggled in to the metaverse. Shit. The pilot's pulling the chopper to a higher altitude. Okay, Sasha, you lost him. the radio says, but you still got a couple of them poon things hanging off your belly, so make sure you don't snag 'em on anything. The cables are stronger than steel. That's all YT needs. She opens the door and jumps out of the chopper. At least that's how it looks to the people inside. Actually, she grabs a handhold on her way down and ends up dangling from the swinging, open door, looking inward towards the belly of the chopper. A couple of poons are stuck to it. 30 feet below, she can see the handles dangling on the ends of their lines, fluttering in the airstream. Looking into the open door, she can't hear Rife, but she can see him, sitting there next to the pilot, motioning, "Down, take it down." Which is what she figured. This hostage thing works two ways. She's no good to Rife unless he's got her, and she's in one piece. The chopper starts losing altitude again, heading back down toward the twin stripe of low glow that marks out the avenue beneath them. YT gets swinging back and forth on the door a little, finally swings in far enough that she can hook one of the poon cables with her foot. This next bit is going to hurt like hell, but the tough fabric of the coverall should prevent her from losing too much skin. And the sight of Tony lunging at her, trying to grab her sleeve, reinforces her own natural tendency not to think about it too hard. She lets go of the chopper's door with one of her hands, grabs the poon cable, winds it around the outside of her glove a couple of times, and then lets go with the other hand. She was right. It does hurt like hell. As she swings down under the belly of the chopper, out of Tony's grasp, something pops inside her hand. Probably one of those dinky little bones. But she gets the poon cable wrapped around her body the same way Raven did when he rappelled off the ship with her, and manages a controlled, burning slide down to the end. Down to the handle, that is. She hooks it onto her belt so she can't fall, and then thrashes around for what seems like a whole minute, until she's not tangled up in the cable anymore, just dangling by the waist, twisting around and around between the chopper and the street, out of control. Then she gets the handle in both hands, and unhooks it from her belt so she's hanging by the arms again, which was the whole point of the exercise. As she rotates, she sees the other chopper above her and off to the side, glimpses the faces watching her, knows that all of this is being relayed, over the radio, to Rife. Sure enough, the chopper cuts to about half its former speed, loses some altitude. She clicks another control and reels out the line all the way to the end, dropping 20 feet in one thrill-packed moment. Now she's flying along, 10 or 15 feet above the highway, doing maybe 45 miles an hour. The logo signs shoot past her on either side like meteors. Other than a swarm of couriers, traffic is light. The rare chopper comes thwacking in, dangerously close, and she looks up at it, just for an instant, and sees Raven looking at her through the window. He's pulled his goggles up on his forehead, just for a second. He's got a certain look on his face, and she realizes that he's not pissed at her at all. He loves her. She lets go of the handle and goes into free fall. At the same time, she jerks the manual release on her cervical collar and goes into full Michelin Man mode as tiny gas cartridges detonate in several strategic locations around her bod. The biggest one goes off like an M80 at the nape of her neck, unfurling the coverall's collar into a cylindrical gas bag that shoots straight up and encases her entire head. Other airbags go off around her torso and her pelvis, paying lots of attention to that spinal column. Her joints are already protected by the armor gel, which is not to say that it doesn't hurt when she lands. She can't see anything because of the airbag around her head, of course, but she feels herself bouncing at least 10 times. She skids for a quarter of a mile and apparently caroms off several cars along the way. She can hear their tires squealing. Finally, she goes butt first through someone's windshield and ends up sprawled across their front seat. They veer into a Jersey barrier. The airbag deflates as soon as everything stops moving, and she claws it away from her face. Her ears are ringing or something. She can't hear anything. Maybe she busted her eardrums when the airbags went off.
But there's also the question of the big chopper, which has a talent for making noise. She drags herself out onto the hood of the car, feeling little hunks of safety glass beneath her carving parallel scratches into the paint job. Rife's big Soviet chopper is right there, hovering at about 20 feet above the avenue, and by the time she sees it, it has already accumulated a dozen more poons. Her eyes follow the cables down to street level, and she sees couriers straining at the lines. This time, they're not letting go. Rife gets suspicious, and the chopper gains altitude, lifting the couriers off their planks. But a passing double-bottom semi sheds a small army of couriers. There must be 100 of them, all pooned onto the poor thing. And within a few seconds, all their magna poons are airborne, and at least half of them stick to the armor plating on the first try. The chopper lurches downward until all of the couriers are on the ground again. 20 more couriers come flying in and nail it. Those that can't grab onto someone else's handle and add their weight. The chopper tries several times to rise, but it may as well be tethered to the asphalt by this point. It starts to come down. The couriers fan out away from it so that the chopper comes down in the middle of a radial burst of poon cables. Tony, the security guy, climbs down out of the open door, moving slowly, high-stepping his way through the web of cables, but somehow retaining his balance and his dignity. He walks away from the chopper until he is out from under the rotor blades, then pulls an Uzi out from under his windbreaker and fires a short airburst. "Get the fuck away from our chopper!" he is shouting. The couriers, by and large, do. They're not stupid. And YT is now walking around safe on the pavement. The mission is accomplished. The code is finished. There's no reason to hassle these chopper dudes anymore. They detach their poons from the belly of the chopper and reel in the cables. Tony looks around and sees YT. She's walking directly toward the chopper. Her sprained body moves awkwardly. "Get back in the chopper, you lucky bitch," he says. YT picks up a loose poon handle that no one has bothered to reel in yet. She hits the button that turns off the electromagnet, and its head drops off the chopper's armor. She reels it in until about 4 feet of slack is there between the reel and the head.
There was this dude named Ahab that I read about, she says, whirling the poon around her head. He got his poon cable all wrapped up around the thing he was trying to poon. It was a big mistake.
She lets the poon fly. It passes up through the plane of the rotor blades, near the center, and she can see the unbreakable cable start to wind itself around the delicate parts of the rotor's axle, like a garrote around a ballerina's neck. Through the chopper's windshield, she can see Sasha reacting, flipping switches frantically, pulling levers, his mouth making a long string of Russian curses. The poon's handle gets snapped out of her hand, and she sees it get whipped into the center like it's a black hole.
I guess he just didn't know when to let go, like some people, she says.
Then she turns around and walks away from the chopper. Behind her, she can hear large pieces of metal going the wrong way, running into one another at high speed. Rife has figured it out a long time ago. He's already running down the middle of the highway with a submachine gun in one hand, looking for a car to commandeer. Above, the RARE chopper hovers and watches. Rife looks up to it and motions forward with one hand, shouting, "Go to LAX! Go to LAX!" The chopper makes one last orbit over the scene, watching as Sasha puts the ruined gunship into cold shutdown, watching furious couriers overwhelming and disarming Tony and Frank and the President, watching as Rife stands in the middle of the left lane and forces a Cosa Nostra pizza car to a stop, forces the driver out. But Raven isn't watching any of these things. He's looking out the window at YT. And as the chopper finally tilts forward and accelerates into the night, he grins at her and gives her the thumbs up. YT bites her lower lip and flips him the bird. With that, the relationship is over, hopefully for all time. YT borrows a plank from an awed skater and pushes herself across the street to the nearest buy and fly and starts trying to call Mom for a ride home.
Oh, yeah. We're almost done, folks. I did say that it was going to be a thrilling conclusion, and man, I was not lying. I tell you. True believers, you knew all this time. You knew it'd be worth it. I wouldn't pick it if it wasn't going to be sweet. Chapter 68. Hero loses Raven a few miles outside of downtown, but it doesn't matter by this point. He goes straight to the plaza and then starts to orbit the rim of the amphitheater at high speed, a one-man picket fence. Raven makes his approach within a few seconds. Hero breaks out of his orbit and heads straight for him, and they come together like a couple of medieval jousters. Hero loses his left arm, and Raven drops a leg. The limbs topple to the ground. Hero drops his katana and uses his remaining arm to draw his one-handed sword, a better match for Raven's long knife anyway. He cuts Raven off just as he's about to plummet over the lip of the amphitheater and forces him aside. Raven's momentum takes him a half-mile away in half a second. Hero chases him down by following a series of educated guesses. He knows this territory like Raven knows the currents of the Aleutians. And then they are blasting through the narrow streets of the metaverse's financial district, waving long knives at each other, slicing and dicing hundreds of pinstriped avatars who happen to get in their way. But they never seem to hit each other. The speeds are just too great, the targets too small. Hero's been lucky so far. He has got Raven caught up in the thrill of competition, made him spoil for a fight. But Raven doesn't need this. He can get back to the amphitheater pretty easily without bothering to kill Hero first. And finally, he realizes it. He sheathes his knife and dives into an alley between skyscrapers. Hero follows him, but by the time he's gotten into that same alley, Raven's gone. Hero goes over the lip of the amphitheater doing a couple of hundred miles an hour and soars out into space, in free fall, above the heads of 250,000 wildly cheering hackers. They all know Hero. He's the guy with the swords. He's a friend of Defivid's. And as his own personal contribution to the benefit, he's apparently decided to stage a sword fight with some kind of hulking, scary-looking daemon on a motorcycle. Don't touch that dial. It's going to be a hell of a show. He lands on the stage and bounces to a halt next to his motorcycle. The bike still works, but it's worthless down here. Raven is 10 meters away, grinning at him. Bombs away, Raven says. He pulls the glowing blue lozenge out of his sidecar with one hand and drops it on the center of the amphitheater. It breaks open like the shell of an egg and light shines out of it. The light begins to grow and take shape. The crowd goes wild. Hero runs toward the egg. Raven cuts him off. Raven can't move around on his feet now because he's lost a leg, but he can still control the bike. He's got his long knife out now, and the two blades come together above the egg, which has become the vortex of a blinding, deafening tornado of light and sound. Colored shapes, foreshortened by their immense speed, shoot from the center of it and take positions above their heads, building a three-dimensional picture. The hackers are going nuts. Hero knows that the hacker quadrant in the Black Sun is, at this moment, emptying itself out. They are all cramming through the exit and running down the street toward the plaza, coming to see Hero's fantastic show of light, sound, swords, and sorcery. Raven tries to shove Hero back. It would work in reality because Raven has such overpowering strength. But avatars are equally strong, unless you hack them up in just the right way. So Raven gives a mighty push and then pulls his knife back so he can take a cut at Hero's neck when Hero flies away from him. But Hero doesn't fly away. He waits for the opening, and then he takes Raven's sword hand off. Then, just in case, he takes Raven's other hand off. The crowd screams in delight. "How do I stop this thing?" Hero says. "Beats me. I just deliver 'em," Raven says. Do you have any concept of what you just did? Yeah, realized my lifelong ambition, Raven says, a huge, relaxed grin spreading across his face. I nuked America. Hero cuts his head off. The crowd of doomed hackers rises to its feet and shrieks. Then they go silent as Hero abruptly disappears. He has switched over to his small, invisible avatar. He is hovering in the air now above the shattered remains of the egg. Gravity takes him right down to the center of it. As he falls, he is muttering to himself. Snow scan. It's the piece of software he wrote while he was killing time on the life raft. The one that searches for snow crash. With hero protagonist seemingly gone from the stage, the hackers turn their attention toward the giant construction rising up out of the egg. All that nonsense with the sword fight must have been just a wacky introductory piece. Hero's typically offbeat way of getting their attention. This light and sound show is the main attraction. The amphitheater is now filling up rapidly as thousands of hackers pour in from all over the place, running down the street from the black sun, streaming out of the big office towers where the major software corporations are headquartered, goggling in to the metaverse from all points in reality as word of the extravaganza spreads down the fiber optic grapevine at the speed of light. The light show is designed as if the latecomers were anticipated. It builds to false climax after false climax, like an expensive fireworks show, and each one is better. It is so vast and complicated that no one sees more than 10% of it. You could spend a year watching it, and over again, and keep seeing new things. It is a mile-high structure of moving two and three-dimensional images, interlocked in space and time. It's got everything in it. Leni Riefenstahl films, the sculptures of Michelangelo, and the fictional inventions of Da Vinci made real. World War II dogfights zooming in and out of the middle, veering out over the crowd, shooting and burning and exploding. Scenes from 1,000 classic films, flowing and merging together into a single, vast, complicated story. But in time, it begins to simplify itself and narrow into a single bright column of light. By this point, it is the music that is carrying the show. A pounding bass beat and a deep, threatening ostinato that tells everyone to keep watching. The best is yet to come. And everyone does watch. Religiously. The column of light begins to flow up and down and resolve itself into a human form. Actually, it is four human forms, female nudes standing shoulder to shoulder, facing outward, like caryatids. Each of them is carrying something long and slender in her hands, a pair of tubes. A third of a million hackers stare at the women, towering above the stage, as they raise their arms above their heads and unroll the four scrolls, turning each one of them into a flat television screen the size of a football field. From the seats in the amphitheater, the screens virtually blot out the sky. They are all that anyone can see. The screens are blank at first, but finally the same image snaps into existence on all four of them at once. It is an image consisting of words. It says, "If this were a virus, you would be dead now. Fortunately, it's not. The metaverse is a dangerous place. How's your security? Call Hero Protagonist Security Associates for a free initial consultation." Oh yeah! Hero protagonist saving the world and advertising himself. Self promoter. Ah, Hero has, as they say, got hustle. Okay, Chapter 69.
This isn't exactly the kind of high-tech nonsense that never, ever worked when we tried it in Vietnam,
Uncle Enzo says. Your point is well taken, but technology has come a long way since then, says Kai, the surveillance man from Ing Security Industries. Kai is talking to Uncle Enzo over a radio headset. His van, full of electronic gear, is lurking a quarter of a mile away in the shadows next to an LAX cargo warehouse. I am monitoring the entire airport and all its approaches with a three-dimensional metaverse display. For example, I know that your dog tags, which you customarily wear around your neck, are missing. I know that you are carrying one Kong buck and 85 Kong pence in change in your left pocket. I know that you have a straight razor in your other pocket. Looks like a nice one, too.
never underestimate the importance of a good grooming.
Uncle Enzo says. But I do not understand why you are carrying a skateboard.
It's a replacement for the one YT lost in front of Ebgok,
Uncle Enzo says.
It's a long story.
Sir, we have a report from one of our franchulates, says a young lieutenant in a mafia windbreaker, jogging across the apron with a black walkie-talkie in one hand. He is not really a lieutenant. The mafia is not very keen on the use of military ranks. But for some reason, Uncle Enzo thinks of him as the lieutenant.
The second chopper set down in a strip mall parking lot about 10 miles from here and met the pizza car and picked up Rife. Then took off again. They are on their way in now. Send someone out to pick up the abandoned pizza car and give the driver a day off,
Uncle Enzo says. The lieutenant looks somewhat taken aback that Uncle Enzo is concerning himself with such a tiny detail. It is as if the Don were going up and down highways picking up litter or something. But he nods respectfully, having just learned something. Details matter. He turns away and begins talking into his radio. Uncle Enzo has serious doubts about this fellow. He is a blazer person, adept at running the small-time bureaucracy of a Nova Sicilia franchulate, but lacking in the kind of flexibility that, for example, YT has. A classic case of what is wrong with the mafia today. The only reason the lieutenant is even here is because the situation has been changing so rapidly, and, of course, because of all the fine men they lost on the Kowloon. Kai comes in over the radio again. YT has just contacted her mother and asked for a ride, he says. Would you like to hear their conversation?
Not unless it has tactical significance,
Uncle Enzo says briskly. This is one more thing to check off his list. He has been worried about YT's relationship with her mother and was meaning to speak with her about it. Rife's jet sits on the tarmac, engines idling, waiting to taxi out onto the runway. In the cockpit are a pilot and co-pilot. Until half an hour ago, they were loyal employees of L. Bob Rife. Then they sat and watched out the windshield as the dozen Rife security drones who were stationed around the hangar variously got their heads blown off, their throats slit, or else just plain dropped their weapons and fell to their knees and surrendered. Now the pilot and co-pilot have taken lifelong oaths of loyalty to Uncle Enzo's organization. Uncle Enzo could have just dragged them out and replaced them with his own pilots, but this way is better. If Rife should, somehow, actually make it onto the plane, he will recognize his own pilots and think that everything is fine. And the fact that the pilots are alone there in the cockpit without any direct mafia supervision will merely emphasize the great trust that Uncle Enzo has placed in them and the oath that they have taken. It will actually enhance their sense of duty. It will amplify Uncle Enzo's displeasure if they should break their oaths. Uncle Enzo has no doubt about the pilots at all. He is less happy with the arrangements here, which were made rather hastily. The problem is, as usual, the unpredictable YT. He was not expecting her to jump out of a moving helicopter and get free from Elbob Rife. He was, in other words, expecting a hostage negotiation somewhat later on, after Rife had flown YT back to his headquarters in Houston. But the hostage situation no longer obtains, and so Uncle Enzo feels it is important to stop Rife now, before he can get back to his home turf in Houston. He has called for a major realignment of Mafia forces, and, right now, dozens of helicopters and technical units are hastily replotting their courses and trying to converge on LAX as quickly as they can. But in the meantime, Enzo is here with a small number of his own personal bodyguards, and this technical surveillance man from Ing's organization. They have shut down the airport. This was easy to do. They just pulled Lincoln Town cars onto all the runways, for starters, and then went into the control tower and announced that in a few minutes they would be going to war. Now, LAX is probably quieter than it has been at any point since it was built. Uncle Enzo can actually hear the faint crashing of surf on the beach, half a mile away. It is almost pleasant here. Weenie toasting, rather. Uncle Enzo is cooperating with Mr. Li, which means working with Ing, and Ing, while highly competent, has a technological bias that Uncle Enzo distrusts. He would prefer a single good soldier in polished shoes, armed with a 9, to 100 of Ing's gizmos and portable radar units. When they came out here, he was expecting a broad open space in which to confront Rife. Instead, the environment is cluttered. Several dozen corporate jets and helicopters are parked on the apron. Nearby is an assortment of private hangars, each with its own fenced-in parking area containing a number of cars and utility vehicles. And they are rather close to the tank farm where the airport's supply of jet fuel is stored. That means lots of pipes and pumping stations and hydraulic folderol sprouting out of the ground. Tactically, the area has more in common with a jungle than with a desert. The apron and runway themselves are, of course, more desert-like, although they have drainage ditches where any number of men could be concealed. So a better analogy would be beach warfare in Vietnam, a broad open area that abruptly turns into a jungle. Not Uncle Enzo's favorite place. The chopper is approaching the perimeter of the airport, Kai says. Uncle Enzo turns to his lieutenant.
Everyone in place? Yes, sir. How do you know that? They all checked in a few minutes ago. That means absolutely nothing. And how about the pizza car? Well, I thought I would do that later, sir. You need to be capable of doing more than one thing at a time.
The lieutenant turns away, shamed and awed.
Kai, Uncle Enzo says, anything interesting happening on our perimeter?
Nothing at all. Nothing at all, Ing says. Ing? Where did Ing come from?
Anything uninteresting?
A few maintenance workers, as normal.
How do you know they are maintenance workers and not Rife soldiers in costume? Did you check their IDs?
Soldiers carry guns, or at least knives. Radar shows that these men do not. QED.
Still trying to get all our men to check in, the lieutenant says. Having a little radio trouble, I guess.
Uncle Enzo puts one arm around the lieutenant's shoulders.
Let me tell you a story, son. From the first moment I saw you, I thought you seemed familiar. Finally, I realized that you remind me of someone I used to know, a lieutenant who was my commanding officer, for a while, in Vietnam.
The lieutenant is thrilled.
Really? Yes. He was young, bright, ambitious, well educated, and well meaning. But he had certain deficiencies. He had a stubborn inability to grasp the fundamentals of our situation over there. A sort of mental block, if you will, that caused those of us who were serving under him to experience the most intense kind of frustration. It was touch and go for a while, son. I don't mind telling you that. How did it work out, Uncle Enzo? It worked out fine. You see, one day I took it upon myself to shoot him in the back of the head.
The lieutenant's eyes got very big, and his face seems paralyzed. Uncle Enzo has no sympathy for him at all. If he screws this up, people could die. Some new piece of radio babble comes in over the lieutenant's headset.
Uncle Enzo?
He says, very quietly and reluctantly.
Yes? You were asking about that pizza car? Yes? It's, not there. Not there? Apparently, when they sit down to pick up Rife, a man got out of the chopper and climbed into the pizza car and drove it away. Where did he drive it to? We don't know, sir. We only had one spotter in the area, and he was tracking Rife. Take off your headset, Uncle Enzo says, and turn off that walkie-talkie. You need your ears. My ears? Uncle Enzo drops into a crouch and walks briskly across the pavement until he is between a couple of small jets. He sets the skateboard down quietly. Then he unties his shoelaces and pulls his shoes off. He takes his socks off, too, and stuffs them into the shoes. He takes the straight razor out of his pocket, flips it open, and slits both of his trouser legs from the hem up to his groin, then bunches the material up and cuts it off. Otherwise, the fabric will slide over his hairy legs when he walks and make noise. My God, the lieutenant says, a couple of planes over. Al is down. My God, he's dead.
Sorry about that. Minor interruption. All right. Chapter 70. Uncle Enzo leaves his jacket on, for now, because it's dark, and because it's lined with satin so that it is relatively quiet. Then he climbs up onto the wing of one of the planes so that his legs cannot be seen by someone crouching on the ground. He hunkers down on the end of the wing, opens his mouth so that he can hear better, and listens. The only thing he can hear at first is an uneven spattering noise that wasn't there before, like water falling out of a half-open faucet onto bare pavement. The sound seems to be coming from a nearby airplane. Uncle Enzo is afraid that it may be jet fuel leaking onto the ground as part of a scheme to blow up this whole section of the airport and take out all opposition at a stroke. He drops silently to the ground, makes his way carefully around a couple of adjacent planes, stopping every few feet to listen, and finally sees it. One of his soldiers has been pinned to the aluminum fuselage of a Learjet by means of a long wooden pole. Blood runs out from the wound, down his pant legs, drips from his shoes, and spatters onto the tarmac. From behind him, Uncle Enzo hears a brief scream that suddenly turns into a sharp, gaseous exhalation. He has heard it before. It is a man having a sharp knife drawn across his throat. It is undoubtedly the lieutenant. He has a few seconds to move freely now. He doesn't even know what he's up against, and he needs to know that. So he runs in the direction the scream came from, moving quickly from cover of one jet to the next, staying down in a crouch. He sees a pair of legs moving on the opposite side of a jet's fuselage. Uncle Enzo is near the tip of the jet's wing. He puts his hands on it, shoves down with all his weight, and then lets it go. It works. The jet rocks toward him on its suspension. The assassin thinks that Uncle Enzo has just jumped up onto the wingtip, so he climbs up onto the opposite wing and waits with his back to the fuselage, waiting to ambush Enzo when he climbs up over the top. But Enzo is still on the ground. He runs in toward the fuselage on silent, bare feet, ducks beneath it, and comes up from underneath with his straight razor in one hand. The assassin, Raven, is right where Enzo expected him. But Raven is already getting suspicious. He stands up to look over the top of the fuselage, and that puts his throat out of reach. Enzo's looking at his legs instead. It's better to be conservative and take what you can get than take a big gamble and blow it. Enzo oh Jesus. So Enzo reaches in, even as Raven is looking down at him, and severs Raven's left Achilles tendon. Then he's turning away to protect himself. Something hits him. Then, as he's turning away to protect himself, something hits him very hard in the chest. Uncle Enzo looks down and is astonished to see a transparent object protruding from the right side of his rib cage. Then he looks up to see Raven's face 3 inches from his. Uncle Enzo steps back away from the wing. Raven was hoping to fall on top of him, but instead tumbles to the ground. Enzo steps back in, reaching forward with his razor, but Raven, sitting on the tarmac, has already drawn a second knife. He lunges for the inside of Uncle Enzo's thigh and does some damage. Enzo sidesteps away from the blade, throwing off his attack, and ends up making a short but deep cut on the top of Raven's shoulder. Raven knocks his arm aside before Enzo can go for the throat again. Uncle Enzo's hurt, and Raven's hurt. But Raven can't outrun him anymore. It's time to take stock of things a little bit. Enzo runs away, though when he moves, terrible pains run up and down the right side of his body. Something thuds into his back, too. He feels a sharp pain above one kidney, but only for a moment. He turns around to see a bloody piece of glass shattering on the pavement. Raven must have thrown it into his back. But without Raven's arm strength behind it, it didn't have enough momentum to penetrate all the way through the bulletproof fabric, and it fell out. Glass knives. No wonder Kai didn't see him on millimeter wave. By the time he gets behind the cover of another plane, his sense of hearing is being overwhelmed by the approach of a chopper. It is Rife's chopper, settling down on the tarmac a few dozen meters from the jet. The thunder of the rotor blades and the blast of the wind seem to penetrate into Uncle Enzo's brain. He closes his eyes against the wind and utterly loses his balance, has no idea where he is until he slams full length onto the pavement. The pavement beneath him is slippery and warm, and Uncle Enzo realizes that he is losing a great deal of blood. Staring across the tarmac, he sees Raven making his way toward the aircraft, limping horrendously, one leg virtually useless. Finally, he gives up on it and just hops on his good leg. Rife has climbed down out of the chopper. Raven and Rife are talking, Raven gesticulating back in Enzo's direction. Then Rife nods his approval, and Raven turns around, his teeth bright and white. He's not grimacing so much as he is smiling in anticipation. He begins to hop toward Uncle Enzo, pulling another glass knife out of his jacket. The bastard is carrying 1,000,000 of those things. He's coming after Enzo, and Enzo can't even stand up without passing out. He looks around and sees nothing but a skateboard and a pair of expensive shoes and socks about 20 feet away. He can't stand up, but he can do the GI crawl, so he begins to pull himself on his elbows forward, even as Raven is hopping toward him one-legged. They meet in an open lane between two adjacent jets. Enzo is on his belly, slumped over the skateboard. Raven is standing, supporting himself with one hand on the wing of the jet, the glass knife glittering in his other hand. Enzo is now seeing the world in dim black and white, like a cheap metaverse terminal. This is how his buddies used to describe it in Vietnam, right before they succumbed to blood loss. "Hope you've done your last rites," Raven says, "because there ain't no time to call a priest." "There is no need for one," Uncle Enzo says, and punches the button on the skateboard labeled Radix Narrow Cone Tuned Shockwave Projector. The concussion nearly blows his head off. Uncle Enzo, if he survives, will never hear well again. But it does wake him up a little bit. He lifts his head off the board to see Raven standing there, stunned, empty-handed, 1,000 tiny splinters of broken glass raining down out of his jacket. Uncle Enzo rolls over on his back and waves his straight razor in the air. "I prefer steel myself," he says. "Would you like a shave?" Oh, buddy. Chapter 71. Rife sees it all and understands it clearly enough. He would love to see how it all comes out, but he's a very busy man. He would like to get out of here before the rest of the Mafia and Ing and Mr. Lee and all those other assholes come after him with their heat-seeking missiles. And there's no time to wait for the gimpy Raven to hop all the way back. He gives a thumbs up to the pilot and begins climbing the steps into his private jet. It's daytime. A wall of billowing orange flame grows up silently from the tank farm a mile away, like a time-lapse chrysanthemum. It is so vast and complicated in its blooming, uncontrolled growth that Rife stops halfway up the stairs to watch. A powerful disturbance is moving through the flame, leaving a linear trail in the light, like a cosmic ray fired through a cloud chamber. By the force of its passage, it leaves behind a shockwave that is clearly visible in the flame, a bright spreading cone that is 100 times larger than the dark source at its apex, a black, bullet-like thing supported on 4 legs that are churning too fast to be visible. It is so small and so fast that L. Bob Rife would not be able to see it if it were not headed directly for him. It is picking its way over a broad tangle of open-air plumbing, the pipes that carry the fuel to the jets, jumping over some obstacles, digging its metallic claws into others, tearing them open with the explosive thrust of its legs, igniting their contents with the sparks that fly whenever its feet touch the pavement. It gathers its 4 legs under it, leaps 100 feet to the top of a buried tank, uses that as a launch pad for another arcing leap over the chain link fence that separates the fuel installation from the airport proper, and then it settles into a long, steady, powerful lope, accelerating across the perfect geometric plane of the runway, chased by a long tongue of flame that extends lazily from the middle of the conflagration, whirling inward upon itself as it traces the currents in that rat thing's aftershock. Something tells L. Bob Rife to get away from the jet, which is loaded with fuel. He turns and half jumps, half falls off the stairs, moving clumsily because he's looking at the rat thing, not at the ground. The rat thing, just a tiny dark thing close to the ground, visible only by virtue of its shadow against the flames, and by the chain of white sparks where its claws dig into the pavement, makes a tiny correction in its course. It's not headed for the jet. It's headed for him. Rife changes his mind and runs up the stairway, taking the steps 3 at a time. The stairway flexes and recoils under his weight, reminding him of the jet's fragility. The pilot has seen it coming, doesn't wait to retract the stairway before he releases the brakes and sends the jet taxiing down the runway, swinging the nose away from the rat thing. He punches the throttles, nearly throwing the jet onto one wing as it whips around in a tight curve, and redlines the engines as soon as he sees the center line of the runway. Now they can only see forward and sideways. They can't see what is chasing them. YT is the only person who can see it happen. Having easily penetrated airport security with her courier pass, she is coasting onto the apron near the cargo terminal. From here, she has an excellent view across half a mile of open runway and sees it all happen. The plane roars down the runway, hauling its door closed as it goes, shooting pale blue flames out of its engine nozzles, trying to build up speed for a takeoff. And Fido chases it down like a dog going after a fat mailman, makes one final tremendous leap into the air, and, turning himself into a Sidewinder missile, flies nose first into the tailpipe of its left engine. The jet explodes about 10 feet off the ground, catching Fido and L. Bob Reif and his virus all together in its fine, sterilizing flame. How sweet! She stays for a while and watches the aftermath. Mafia choppers coming in, doctors jumping out with doc boxes and blood bags and stretchers. Mafia soldiers scurrying between the private jets, apparently looking for someone. A pizza delivery car takes off from one of the parking areas, tires squealing, and a Mafia car peels out after it in hot pursuit. But after a while it gets boring, and so she skates back to the main terminal, under her own power mostly, though she manages to poon a fuel tanker for a while. Mom's waiting for her in her stupid little jellybean car by the United baggage claim, just like they arranged on the phone. YT opens the door, throws her plank into the back seat, and climbs in. Home? Mom says. Yeah, home seems about right. And that was Neal Stephenson's Snow Crash. So how about that, huh? I told you it'd be worth it. I told you. Y'all knew. I wouldn't lie about such a thing. So how sick was that? Pretty sick is the answer. Yes. I don't need answers from everyone. I know. I know what you all are thinking. You just need a minute to take it in and breathe. So yeah, as I've mentioned before, I do this every Saturday, Storytime Saturdays. Usually I do it starting at noon Eastern Standard Time. This week I had to do it an hour earlier due to scheduling conflicts. As for what I'll be doing on this segment next week, I don't know. I have a lot of short stories I can do. I'm probably not going to start another novel just yet. Probably give that another week or two before I figure out if there's a novel I want to pick up and read aloud for people. Um, I'll be honest, mostly it kind of boils down to what do I want to read, and then I force my opinion on other people who uh, can always tune me out anyway. So, uh, yeah. So I do other streams throughout the week. I have a Mecha Monday stream where I do giant robot or mecha adjacent, giant robot related or mecha adjacent activities, typically video games. Uh, and I also have a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do Warframe stuff for a couple hours every Wednesday. So yeah, if you have an interest in either of those or in listening to bleh, I can't talk today. Or in listening to more short stories, typically science fictional in nature, or entire novels read aloud by yours truly. Not the character in Snow Crash, though, but me. Um, Fragath, your narrator. Then please feel free to tune in. All right, folks. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. And gosh, have a great week until next time. All right. Bye.